So, Benjamin, let's turn to the voters here. Fidesz still won, despite of all of this manipulation, still won more votes than any other party in Hungary. Why is Orban's message being welcomed by so many Hungarians?
Well, sure, he does have 49% of the vote, and or his party has 49% of the vote. And there's a lot of factors to consider here. This is a machine with a lot of moving parts. On one hand, what we do see, and this is something that the election monitors also pointed out, is that there is this public employment scheme. It's essentially a program here that the government uses to cushion its unemployment figures. And so what they do is, instead of giving people a welfare check, what they'll do is they'll give you a little bit more than a welfare check, but you have to work in this public employment scheme. And this is a job that is available to you, if your mayor is able to lobby out that kind of money, which pretty much offers you about double of what your unemployment check would be, which is still far less than what minimum wage is in Hungary. And so you see that certain segments of society here, and I'm referring to the disenfranchised members of Hungarian society, those are the ones who take advantage of this program and who work in this public employment scheme program. And there have been recorded instances of this program, or one's participation in this program, kind of being used to, in essence, buy votes. So we saw instances of this being reported in the last election. Transparency International and a few think tanks and an investigative journalism NGO actually did reporting on this, a very, very interesting analysis they did in the previous election. And as we heard in the election observers' remarks today, this issue was again brought up. Clientelism is another big issue here. So the state is an enormous employer, and a lot of people are afraid of losing their jobs. And you have to go out and support the party, I suppose, if you want to keep your job. But I think the most important thing out of all of this is what I had said earlier regarding the use of mass media in Hungary. The shutting out of independent or opposition media, the closing of such outlets, the takeover of such outlets by oligarchs close to the prime minister, all of this has a snowball effect, to where if you're walking around certain areas outside of the city, if you go out to rural Hungary and you speak to people, you realize that these are the messages they've been hearing. It's almost as though I've experienced this myself in many cases, where what people think is happening in the great world around them is fueled entirely by what they hear from these propaganda outlets. So it's a very bizarre situation. There's a lot of factors, a lot of cultural factors, a lot of historical factors, but it's very difficult to sum up in a few minutes.
Benjamin, the kind of job scheme you describe there, it's something that many people in a lot of communities could hope for, in terms of a guaranteed job, a guaranteed source of income that's more than social welfare. What's wrong with that scheme? And if that's what got him the votes, how can you blame the people?
Well, I wouldn't want to mislead anybody here. I'm not saying that there's anything right or wrong with the scheme. What I can say, though, and this is the reality of the situation, is that the people that are employed through these programs, while yes, the amount of money they receive is certainly helping them, keep food in the fridge, being able to feed their families, the income they earn off of this is far less than minimum wage. And what we know is that people employed through the scheme have actually been doing the jobs of people that ought to be hired at least at minimum wage. So you're almost seeing a replacement of the labor here, which is a very interesting phenomenon. The other thing is that it's not a certain job. So this is cyclical, and it's not like you don't know for sure whether you'll have this job in 1 year or not. And one of the other problems here that many sociologists and economists have also brought up with this program is that it's not transitioning those who are taking part in the program onto the actual labor market. And so the kinds of jobs these people are doing depends on where they are in the country. I've seen people in the countryside who just go out and pick up trash. But they ought to be doing this for 8 hours a day, but there is only so much trash you can pick up in a given street. So it's kind of like the cases that I've seen, you're just kind of walking around doing something until the mayor tells you to do something else.
All right. Now, in terms of the mandate that's been given, what are the next steps? What do you expect from Orban?
So the next parliament is going to be formed at the end of this month. And I think we can expect the ruling party, Fidesz, to move forward with its Stop Soros bill, which is targeting NGOs, in particular human rights NGOs. And what this would do is it would impose some pretty heavy sanctions on NGOs, or demand more transparency from them, despite the already very stringent transparency requirements imposed on NGOs, and essentially stigmatize them. And so this is something that we could definitely hope to see. And as I mentioned earlier, this war against George Soros that the prime minister is trying to have the society believe is actually happening. He needs to be able to show something for it. So what I do think we'll see is this war against civil society, in particular organizations that have, through one way or another, received money from George Soros's Open Society foundations. I think we can expect the prime minister to go after his critics, both in the opposition and in civil society, and also in media. This is something he alluded to last month on March 15th during the Hungarian a national holiday. He said that he would exact political, legal, and moral satisfaction from these enemies. And that's pretty alarming. One of the things that we saw happen last year that Fidesz wasn't able to push through Parliament was an attempt to kind of overhaul the judiciary. It's a rather complex story, but now that they have the 2/3, they will be able to do that if they so choose. And I have no reason to believe that that's no longer on the agenda. Many of the judges that I've spoken to have actually raised concerns to me about this, off the record, of course, not stating their names. They are worried that the judiciary is going to experience some more overhauls if Fidesz gets 2/3, and they certainly did.
What is this great animosity towards George Soros that has managed to become a campaign?
There's a lot of historical and cultural elements to this. It's very important to remember here that Fidesz, as a movement in the last years of socialism in Hungary, was funded by George Soros. They received funding from George Soros. The prime minister received funding from George Soros. The prime minister received a scholarship to go study in the United Kingdom from George Soros. George Soros bought this movement operating under a dictatorship, a copy machine. If you can imagine how enormous of a thing that is back in those days to have a copy machine. They certainly did enjoy the benefits of having a donor who felt like these civil causes were something that were worthwhile supporting it, especially in this region. What we do see, though, is that this propaganda looks an awful lot like the propaganda that existed in Hungary during the interwar period. These billboards I was talking about earlier about George Soros, what they were black and white photos of an old Jew laughing, plastered all across the country, everywhere. And this does have a very nasty feeling of anti-Semitism to it. And you have to keep in mind here that, as you mentioned in the beginning, Fidesz is to all intents and purposes a far-right party. Hungary's largest opposition party is a far-right party. So when you talk about these kinds of posters out there, when you talk about these grand conspiracies of international financiers trying to take away a country's status as a nation state and take away its Christian heritage. You know, a lot of people feel this is dog whistle anti-Semitism, and apparently it does seem to work. There are, as the as the election indicated here, there are people who buy into this.
Benjamin, were there any similarities between, say, Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, the support he got from the far right in terms of the Steve Bannons and Breitbart News, and what happened in Hungary during this campaign?
Definitely during this campaign, and I think that the American alt-right looks at Prime Minister Orban as something of a hero. The alt-right in the United States looks a lot like the mainstream right in Hungary. You have a lot of this, this ethnocentrism, I guess one would call it. Just last year, the Prime Minister of Hungary, at a conference of industrialists, announced that Hungary, in order to be successful, must retain its ethnic homogeneity. Now, this is the Prime Minister of an EU member state. This is the Prime Minister of a NATO ally, saying to the leading businessmen in his country that in order for the country to be successful, it must retain its ethnic homogeneity. So you can definitely see a link here between the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's words and what a lot of people in the American alt-right are saying.
Benjamin, in 2015, 2016, when we saw a flood of Syrian refugees coming across the Mediterranean, trying to claim refugee status or just moving through some countries to get to safe havens, Hungary, we saw on television, was one of the worst countries in terms of ensuring that the refugees were rejected. Was this a large part of Orban's campaign and the success of his campaign in winning this election?
Well, there's a very important distinction to make here, is that in Hungary, the ruling party and the prime minister almost never draws a distinction between refugees, migrants, asylum seekers. And when your question, you asked over the past few years of these people trying to come to Hungary, the reality is that when the refugee crisis really peaked in 2015, yes, Hungary was one of the spots that they came to, but they didn't come to Hungary. They passed through Hungary. They went through Hungary to Western Europe and to Northern Europe. Hungary did build this fence, and this fence is the central theme of Viktor Orban's campaign. This campaign was exclusively about immigration. It had absolutely nothing to do with anything else. It was about immigration. It was about George Soros wanting to implant these people into Hungary. So this campaign was pretty much, this was the only issue.
All right, Benjamin, I thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.